Well, it's great to be back after 15 minutes. So this is a little bit different because we do not have a moderator. So what we're going to do is talk until we run out of things to say, and then we're going to open it up for questions. Do we need an introduction? Frank Bruni, my distinguished colleague, now at Duke University, contributing writer to the New York Times. You read, I'm sure you get his wonderful newsletter and his columns. Many years a columnist at the Times. Before that, a distinguished restaurant critic, so he's eaten everywhere and can actually discuss this stuff. Before that, he was a foreign correspondent based in Rome. Before that, he covered the election of 2000 and flew around the country with then Governor George W. Bush.
I can summarize this for you. I don't have a career, I have an attention deficit disorder.
And the author most recently of The Beauty of Dusk, which is really a fantastic book, available in the bookstore, signed. So whatever else you do, make sure to get the book. And I'm Bret Stephens. I'm the somewhat right-wing columnist at the New York Times. And
emphasis on the somewhat.
Emphasis on the somewhat. So what I want to do is begin by asking Frank, because this is a conversation between a liberal, right? You describe yourself liberal, progressive?
Yeah, I mean, if I have to wear a label, but we can talk about the problem with labels.
Right. And a conservative, and can we even talk to each other, and can we even learn something from one another? So, I guess I would begin by asking you, Frank, why don't you hate me?
Probably because I haven't yet spent enough time with you. No, but I mean, before you came to the Times, I think we'd run into each other at a couple of cocktail parties. But I was told, before I met you and got to know you, that you were an enemy of science and denied adamantly that there was any possibility of a change in climate. I was told that you were an Islamophobe, in that way that phobe and ism gets thrown around rather promiscuously. I think I was probably told that you tortured kittens in a cigar bar somewhere on the Upper East Side of Manhattan.
That part is true.
But all of that came from the very nuanced ecosphere of Twitter and its like. And then I met you, and I talked to you, as people do. And you and I do disagree on some things, not as much as people might expect, but I learned quickly in talking to you that you are thoughtful, that you come at the positions you come at honestly, and with intelligence and research, that none of those broad statements that were made in places like Twitter were remotely close to the more nuanced truth. And I think your and my friendship, and we are good friends, Bret has stayed in my home with me in Chapel Hill, our friendship is an example of the fact that when people actually meet, and they can no longer regard each other as caricatures, which is what Twitter and its like reduces us all to, we find that even though we have differences, we can be respectful about them. Because I understand that you are not kind of playing some villain's part, and you are someone who has ideas I can learn from and engage with.
So you mentioned something that I think is interesting, which is that Twitter and all forms of social media, rather than carry out the function that the name would suggest, social media, they're really a form of anti-social media. The media ecosystem is doing more to split us apart than practically any other technology, sort of the most sinister Russian spy could possibly devise. So let's talk a little bit more, since we're both media creatures, about what is happening to that media ecosystem, that we are so much more divided, I think, today than we would have been 20 or 40 or certainly 60 years ago when Walter Cronkite set the tableau of what Americans accepted as truth and fact.
Well, I'm more curious to hear your answer to this than my own, but I'll offer one first. I mean, I think human beings are, to a great extent, we're all tribal by nature. And social media has encouraged that and ossified that in a very scarily efficient way. I mean, I don't know that we always mean to do this, but when you follow people on Twitter, if you bookmark things on the web, the things you like or share that become part of your algorithm, all of these things just drive us further and further into an enclave of people who think exactly the way we do. And that facilitates that caricature that we were talking about before. But we segregate also in our physical lives. And when we talk about blue places and red places, I mean, I look around me in North Carolina, and there are very, very few purple towns. There are red towns and blue towns that together on a state level render the place purple. But we are increasingly going toward people we think will mirror our views, will echo them back to us, and that is the enemy of any kind of common ground or compromise. But you take it away.
So, it was my wife's birthday the other day, so we went to a restaurant nearby, and I was asking the waiter what I should order, whether it was the ravioli or the venison, and he said, well, do you want earthy or comfy? And I ordered comfy, which meant the ravioli. Basically, there are two modes of approaching life, which is one that underscores comfort and the other that underscores some kind of encounter with something different. And we have devised, thanks in part to technologies that permit it, thanks in part to a free society that allows us to self-segregate in ideological enclaves, other factors as well, we've become a society that likes comfy when it comes to ideas. We want to listen to people who think as we do, but only say it a little bit better. And it always astounds me whenever I meet someone who says, oh, I love your column, and I agree with you, right? Could you possibly love my column if you didn't agree with me? You should be able to do that. I read our colleague Paul Krugman. I disagree with him most of the time, and I think what a fantastic writer. He is able to powerfully make a case, which I think is wrong, but at least forces me to contend. And we are not doing enough socially, and we're certainly not doing enough within the media to create environments of encounter, to create environments in which you are going to be forced to contend with views, ideas with which you disagree. So you're either part of MSNBC Nation or part of Fox Nation. I don't know what CNN is these days. It's in transition.
It's in an undecided limbo.
It's moving in some direction or another. You're faithful readers of the Wall Street Journal's editorial page or of more liberal editorial pages. There's no growth in that when you're living in the land of media comfy. You are never going to you're never even going to have the opportunity to sharpen your arguments against someone with whom you disagree. And I think if there's some big philanthropists out here who are thinking about how to change the media ecosystem, it would be wonderful if we could once again have shows in which diametrically opposite points of view contended face-to-face on an equal basis in a regular way. They're not there. They're not in the media. And by the way, they're not in our universities either, where too much of academic life has the quality of, and maybe you'll tell me different because you're now at Duke, has the quality of an echo chamber.
Well, I want to say something else about the media because we beat up so much on social media, and you just correctly said the media itself is a big part of the problem. I don't think we model the kind of behavior that you're talking about, the kind of ability to think outside a box, to not hew to a stereotype. And I'm haunted to this day by something that happened to me that illustrated this. A number of years ago, before I had a contract with CNN and I could go on different shows, MSNBC called me because a story had just come out in the Times, or maybe it was the Washington Post, I forget, but our colleague Jason Horowitz wrote it. I can't remember which publication he was working on then. And it was a story about, it was when Mitt Romney was running for president. It was a story about how when Mitt Romney had been a high school student, apparently he had been very cruel to a classmate who was deemed to have been effeminate, and this was kind of labeled in retrospect by classmates who remembered it, some form of kind of homophobic harassment of a student who appeared to be gay. we're talking about something that had happened decades and decades earlier. We're talking about high school, an environment where people are very cruel to one another, et cetera. Anyway, I got a call from a producer at MSNBC who said, because I wrote a lot, I was writing a lot then, I write a lot still about gay rights and that sort of thing, and I'm an openly gay man, said, would you be willing to come on tomorrow and join a panel and talk about this Mitt Romney story? And I said, sure, I'd be happy to, I got the time and all that. And then I got an email later saying, we just want a little preview, what are you likely to say about it? And I said, I'm likely to say that I don't want to make too many stern judgments or extrapolate too far from something that Mitt Romney did 4 decades ago in a completely different culture and moment in time. And in the same way we don't define Barack Obama today by his membership in the Choom Gang back when he was in school in Hawaii, I don't know that I would define Mitt Romney today through this lens. An hour later, I got an email that my services were no longer required on that panel. And I tuned in the next day and saw somebody else in my stead bashing Mitt Romney. Too many of us in the media, for financial reasons, because we want certain bookings, because it's easier for the whole universe if we play strictly to a given type, too many of us end up locked into this brand and we never deviate from it, and how we can ask other people to be more elastic and forgiving in their thinking when we don't do it ourselves is really something.
And is that a matter, so is that a matter of the incentive structure of the media today, or is it, is it, about who goes to the media? I mean, I think one of the problems with our industry is that we draw from a particular stream in this country. I mean, let's face it, we're kind of, whatever our other differences, we're sort of type, highly educated people, good writers, high SATs, went into prestige industries, rubbed shoulders with important people. This is very different from what the media was 50 years ago, when it was really in many ways like a blue-collar profession.
Yes.
Guys like Jimmy Breslin, right? I mean, they weren't part of the Davos set. They were part of the Jimmys on 12th Street set, right? They were drinking beer and scotch, not California Chardonnay. Something has changed in terms of the nature of our industry. Is that your perception, having been in it for a while?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's become a profession in which people are compensated in a whole different way and in accordance with wearing certain labels. Yeah. That was an era when journalists were very different, but I also don't think they marched into the public square as a very defined brand, that the more defined you became in your brand, the more marketable you became. So that is the incentive structure, but it's not just in the media, it's socially too. You mentioned I teach at a university now, and when I get to know students better, and I talk to them in kind of off-the-record earnest ways about how they feel about speaking up in class, if they're not going to say the kind of most liberally or leftist correct thing, they're worried about the social price of that, just the way somebody in the media might be worried about the economic price of straying from type. Everybody is kind of worried about meeting some opposition that is going to diminish the quality of their life, and so they begin parroting whatever the people around them have to say, because you talk about comfort, that's the ultimate comfort.
If we can put a parenthesis around Fox, is the mainstream media overwhelmingly liberal, progressive?
It is, and we get very testy when people point that out, but we're never able to really refute it. I mean, in the same way in higher ed, are our professors in academia overwhelmingly liberal and democratic? Yes. That's more extreme than the media in terms of the imbalance, but yeah, the media is predominantly, when you kind of edit out Fox News and the Daily Caller and discrete places.
Although it's sometimes interesting the ways in which you find things not quite comporting to type, but in amusing ways. Back in the days before the pandemic, when I went to the Times' office on a fairly regular basis, I had this experience which happened to me so many times that I thought, it suggested something, which is that I would be in the elevator with one other person, and they would lean in and they would say, "I like your column." And I always had to say, is someone listening? Is there...
Well, these days someone might be, but you never know, right?
Is there a microphone? But I think what it suggested is there's actually more ideological diversity, it's just sort of suppressed, or people are afraid to kind of identify as something other than conforming to.
Once we've segregated ourselves, whether it's online or in the physical world, once we've segregated ourselves into our ideological tribes, the price of dissent just feels too high. But I think, and I would love your reaction to this, because I think a lot about this. Why are we so eager and quick to dismiss people who we see as being on the opposite side of the partisan line, et cetera? And I'm just increasingly bothered by the arrogance of it, right? I mean, we don't just have a crisis of partisanship, we have a crisis of humility. I'm not so sure. But I'm not so damn sure I'm right about everything I'm passionate about. I hope I'm right about it. I kind of try to think about why I believe I'm right about it. I try to kind of investigate my own beliefs. But I want to hear what other people have to say, because I'm not at all convinced. I know the limits of my own intellect, and I want to know what other people think to make me smarter. We have a crisis of humility.
So I think it's an interesting point, and it's a particular crisis because it's a crisis we're hiding from ourselves. I mean, there's an old rabbinical joke. A great rabbi is on his deathbed, and his followers are around him, and they say, "Oh, Rav, what will we do without your sense of justice?" And the guy's on his deathbed. He can hardly speak, or we don't even know if he's listening. Another one says, "Oh, Rav, what will we do without your wisdom?" A third one, without your magnanimity. And finally, after they go over all these various attributes of the old rabbi, you hear this old creaking voice say, "And you have nothing to say about my humility."
My humility is my best quality.
Yeah. And it's, but people who, my experience, and this is, I think, one of the reasons why I became an instinctive conservative early on, which was that my encounter with a lot of self-described liberals and progressives is they were so open-minded, or thought of themselves as such open-minded people, except at the first encounter with a view that differed from their own, at which point that view was bigoted, intolerant, antediluvian, uninformed, controlled by Russian bots, and so on. And this was a pervasive experience of mine, until I just started to think, well, this is surely not true of everyone on the other side, and it's surely just as true of my own side. Checking this kind of self-certainty is a hard thing to do. I was fortunate, I think, in my education, in that when and we were talking about this just earlier at breakfast, now there's a kind of idea among students, especially students at expensive elite universities, that they're customers and they get to choose what matters to them. When you and I were students, we were not customers, we were acolytes, we were disciples in a sense. And I'll never forget, I was having an argument with a senior at the University of Chicago, and I was fumbling with my argument, and he was this big, strong guy with dreadlocks, and he looked at me and he said, "Stephens, you have the verbal acuity of shampoo." And that was 32 years ago, and I am still wrecked by the devastation of that put down. It did a lot of good. It did me a lot of good.
See, today you would report that to the administration and an apology. No, that's not a joke. That's a reality.
Do you feel any power now that you're as a teacher to kind of push back against that sense of entitlement and arrogance, that crisis in humility? I assume you're seeing it in your students as well when they get an A- and they think it's the end of their life.
No, I've had students in writing classes where we're professional writers, and by the way, this isn't the average. This isn't most students, but it's more than a few who will literally come back to you and say, "This paragraph that you said was not so good. I think it's really great. Let me tell you why." And I thought, well, okay, we can go down that road, but at the end of the day, your editor, my editor gets the final word, the teacher gets the final word. I'm like a broken record in the classes I teach, and it's gone okay so far, but I'm a broken record saying that I want you to leave this class. And I think this sentiment is very in the spirit of our discussion right now. I want you to leave this class impressed by how much you don't know and not how much you know. And to me, the mark of a really good class or a really good education is that you leave asking 4 times the number of questions about the world and the subject than you were asking when you began, and they're much more intelligent than the 2 questions you came in with. Is this making an impression? I don't know, but I mean, I'll go down fighting.
So let's return to the topic of our discussion, which is what a conservative can learn from a liberal and what a liberal can learn from a conservative.
So why don't you hate me?
What?
So why don't you hate me?
Because you're so charming and, delightful. I don't know. You know what?
Because I bought you breakfast sandwiches when you stayed with me. That's why you don't hate me.
They were really good. They were really good. Why don't I hate you? Look, for one thing, it helps to be married to someone whose political views are not your own. I think that if you can understand that there's more to a person than his or her politics, your life is going to be really enriched. And if you can understand that a person can hold their views sincerely and intelligently on account of their experience in life, on account of the way in which they've processed that experience, you're gonna live a more fruitful life. I try to approach views with which I differ as an opportunity to think and maybe even rethink. And it doesn't come naturally. The natural instinct is to say, well, I'm right and the rest of you are idiots, right? It requires some kind of education. One of the reasons, what preceded you in terms of my impression of you going back was that you wrote really well. And I always have high respect for people who can write beautiful English prose with the kind of vigor and efficiency and style and humor that you bring to every sentence. So it's very hard to read a Frank Bruni column and say, oh, this guy's got to be a total creep, because you just exude kind of bonhomie and charm and wit and sophistication. But there's more to that, which is that
I'm going to have to up the check I was going to write you. I'm doubling the figure now.
Well, there's more to that because my own politics have changed a fair bit. I wouldn't describe myself by any means as a liberal. I think of myself as a conservative, but a very different conservative now than I was, say, in 2015 when I first started coming to Rancho Mirage.
Someone hadn't come along the political scene yet or came along in 2015. That's a year you did not choose at random.
That's exactly it, which is you were able to look at your own side in a different light and say something is deeply amiss, and it can't just be one person. It's a set of ideas that weld underneath like a volcano or lava gathering, magma, I guess, sorry to the geologists out there, magma gathering under a volcano and finally erupted. So that forced me to contend with aspects of the conservative movement that I had understood before but hadn't recognized with their full force. The vehemence of the racial and ethnic dislikes and hatreds which were coursing through a lot of the Republican Party, I was far too prone to dismiss as a kind of Buchananite fringe and not recognize how central they had become in the sort of intellectual constitution of the Republican Party. And so that forced me to, part company. It forced me to ask hard questions, also just life's experience, taking greater cognizance of the fact that my mother is a refugee to this country. And that changes the way in which you approach what America needs to be about. I still have profound reservations about the left and what I think is a kind of almost totalitarian instinct on the left to demand conformity not only in how other people behave, but how they think as well. But I need to look at my own side a little more deeply, and I think that shapes the way I look at the other side too.
I think Donald Trump did something really, really important, right? So we forget because there's such common cause now between, I don't know, what's the right phrase, moderate Republicans, never Trumpers or whatever. I mean, it brought a lot of formerly Republicans or currently Republicans in sort of I don't know what the labels are, but it brought them and Democrats into a lot of common cause. We forget that prior to Donald Trump, the two parties were sufficiently at each other's throats. And in bringing many Republicans or former Republicans or whatever we're calling them together with Democrats, I mean, he should have taught us, and we should hold on to this, that there are values we have in common, even amid all of our disagreements. You cared as much as someone, you still call yourself a Republican, right?
No.
Okay.
I don't. I call myself a conservative,
Okay.
not a Republican.
You still call yourself a conservative, but you have made common cause with many people whom you didn't make common cause with before because you realized that they and you both shared an unwillingness to go down the road to autocracy, distaste, opposition to corruption. These commonalities, these common values were over there and were always there. And in a kind of weird way, Trump showed us that even amid our differences, we have things that bring us together.
Don't you think it's also happening in the opposite direction, which is I encounter a great many people who in a million years would not vote Republican, who are increasingly in a kind of quiet or not so quiet dissent with one side or another of progressive orthodoxies as they're kind of bubbling to the surface, not necessarily at a political level, but certainly at a cultural level in schools and associations in the media. Is this something you're seeing as well?
Absolutely. I think, in fact, it's an interesting moment because there are a lot of us who wear the label Democrat or liberal who are as concerned about that progressive orthodoxy as you are, who think it's gone every bit as far as you think it's gone. The problem is we're not being given a political alternative right now. And this is such a weird moment because I actually think if either of the two parties could lop off the extremists and talk common sense and moderation to the electorate, that party, if they could do that, could sew up a majority that would last them for the next several decades. There is this huge opportunity right now for the Democratic Party that is not adequately seizing because it does not deal as sternly as it should and as it does not reject progressive orthodoxy to the extent that it should. And of course, the Republican Party, in coddling the Marjorie Taylor Greens of the world, has made itself anathema to many Democrats who hate this progressive orthodoxy but feel I have nowhere else to turn. If I vote for a Republican, this is the feeling, I'm voting for autocracy, and I would rather take some of this crazy social justice excess than that.
So do you think there's a political opportunity here, either for, I mean, look at what happened, say, in Ohio. J.D. Vance wins, but wins narrowly. Mike DeWine, sort of average, typical Republican, wins easily. Brian Kemp, kind of normie Republican, wins easily. Herschel Walker, of course, thank God, loses. It seems to me there is a kind of, to coin a phrase, a silent majority of people who want exactly what you're describing, and yet the parties are not.
That's the problem.
Are not providing it. So, what's the impediment and the opportunity? What's stopping kind of normal liberals, normal conservatives from establishing that they're comfortable without constantly having to bend to one fringe or the other?
I mean, there are many things, but I'll name three. I mean, number one on that list, the primary process. If you look at who votes in primaries, parties end up nominating people, this happens on both sides of the aisle, who are probably not, in many cases, the best general election candidate. In fact, if there's one thing Democrats have done better than Republicans in recent cycles, it's not send along into a competitive election someone who's the least electable.
Well, and Democrats are also supporting some of the least electable Republicans.
Yes,
you know,
which is a lovely little wrinkle of our democracy,
yeah,
where you send money to an extremist campaign, which if that works out not as you intended,
yeah,
you did something really crazy. But can I go back to something else
yeah,
you said, and then we're gonna let people ask some questions. But you mentioned your wife has different political views. I My immediate family, in terms of my brothers, my father, my sister, my extended family, is a riot of different political views.
So are my children, by the way.
Yeah. And because we are so self-segregated, not just online but physically, most of us don't get to experience the human being who has these political views. And we assume all of these things about a person who has a set of political views that we don't like. And once you actually have them in your lives, you realize, no, there is no correlation between someone having concerns about a social safety net that draws too much money away from the public treasury. That person is often one of the most generous people interpersonally to their friends and their family members. There's often very little linkage between a political view and what you would shallowly assume is the personal behavior that would go with that. And when you see that people who care a lot about fiscal sanity and care a lot about the size of government and regulation, which is something that's worth caring about, when you see that those people actually in their own lives are generous, caring, loving people, you can no longer make these sorts of associations that allow for the sorts of caricatures that drive us.
Right, and when you meet people whose politics are impeccably progressive and liberal and are raising thoughtful, disciplined, intelligent, civic-spirited children and contributing to their societies in a way that models what conservatives think America should look like, you see the mirror image
exactly
of exactly
but
that.
you have to be interacting with these people to have that education and that illumination.
So, but I would add something more. You have to be interacting with them. You have to know them as your neighbors and as your coworkers. I think the other thing that's missing, honestly, is literature. One of the things that reading great literature taught me is the complexity of the human spirit. When you read great books, you encounter characters who are not simplifications, are not caricatures. Whether it's Anna Karenina or characters in Moby Dick or the great Faulknerian characters. You see that human beings are made of are composites of weird stuff, right? And it enriches your idea of what you can expect from other people. One of I think the problems of our age is that not just on social media or not just on Twitter or in politics, but even in the movies that we watch, everything is kind of reduced to these caricaturish archetypes, the perfect villain, the perfect victim, the perfect hero, and that's I think a real problem with the fact that we don't inhabit the same kind of literary culture that, say, my mother did back in the 1950s and 1960s. That's something that a writers' festival, I think, uniquely can do. To have, it's not just that politics should inform great literature, but literature should inform great politics. We can make our political systems better, our political life better, by reading more widely and more deeply.
And that's not happening. Yeah. No, it's interesting. You talk about great literature, just for that matter, good fiction. Good fiction is about precisely those things that are absent from our politics today: nuance, complexity, and empathy. And in fact, there's a body of scholarship about the fact that people who read more fiction tend to be more empathetic, I think, for all the reasons that you just discussed. But I mean, sadly, not only is much of our popular culture, not only does a lot of it present these very kind of politically one-dimensional views of the world, it's marketed that way.
Yeah.
So you not only have red and blue states, you have red and blue shows. You have a whole strand of stuff that one camp is listening to and watching, and a different strand that another camp is listening to and watching. And if you can't have those sorts of cultural conversations, how are you supposed to have political conversations? If your frames of reference and your influences are entirely different, how do you find common ground?
Yeah, it's that great Moynihan line. He said the central conservative truth, I'm paraphrasing, is that politics is downstream from culture. The central liberal truth is that politics can rise above culture and save it from itself. Why don't we open it up to some questions? You know what? I'm going to go back to front, if you don't mind. So the gentleman in the red sweater in the back. Centrist Party, a possibility?
I don't think in the near future, because I think the way the structure is set up, the way the system is, it's impossible to get the ample oxygen. I think the desire is there, but it's not a desire that's structured enough to make that happen in the near future. It's funny, you're using the word centrist. It's not a word that came up in our conversation yet. It's a word that I love in private, but I avoid in public, because one of the symptoms of how diseased our discussion has become is when you define yourself or as a centrist, or are defined by someone else as a centrist, it's almost seen as synonymous with weak-willed. With not having any. Yeah.
It's soup without salt. That's
it's like you are kind of an intellectual infant that you haven't been able to choose, shirts or skins.
I think there's a possibility, not for a centrist party, for the Electoral College makes third parties very difficult. It makes it difficult for them to succeed, and you'd have to see the collapse of one of the two parties, the way the Whigs collapsed and were given over to the Republicans. I do think there's a possibility for a charismatic political leader that is able to harness the innate decency and good sense of the center, whether it's center-right or center-left. And I think Obama actually had that opportunity. I'm not sure he governed the way he campaigned,
right.
But the campaign of yes, we can, that sense of transcendence and unity that he brought with him both to his rhetoric and his very being, is sort of the formula that you need to find a candidate, Republican or Democrat, who could appeal at least to 5% of the people on the other side.
If you could get, and this is an enormous if, but let's say you had, people are talking a lot about if the Republican primary is so crowded, Trump may sneak back to the nomination even though he's lost a lot of support. If you had a situation develop where the primary was crowded enough and there were enough kind of Trump alternatives that Trump people were going to, that a Larry Hogan sneaked through somehow, I think Larry Hogan would have potent general election appeal and would bring to government the kind of centrism that you're referencing, even if he's not representing a new party of centrists. But the circumstances have to be such that these people get through the primary system, whether we're talking about House, Senate, or presidential races.
The gentleman in the front.
Back to the internet. How do we maintain a freedom of information, yet deal with the vicious misinformation? Don't just analyze it. If you had to make the policy, either of you, of what to do, what do you do with it? We've unleashed this internet, which is amazing. More information at our fingertips than ever before. But it's also unleashed, back to your tribal words, the worst in us that all of us have that comes out. And
It is.
itself with the algorithms that you then just reinforce the same.
It is Pandora's box, yeah. I'm really leery of any sort of government solution to this in terms of regulation, because the people who decide what to censor today and the people who decide what to censor tomorrow, you may love censorship today and hate it 5 years from now because it's in the eye of the beholder. I would find a way, and this is really Pollyanna, because we already ask education, K-12 education, to do more than it seems to be able to do, but I would find a way to build into our curriculums lessons about and education about news literacy, turning young people into conscious consumers of the internet. Because here's the thing, I don't think people set out to have the internet and social media do to them what it ends up doing to them. I think it happens in a very spontaneous way, and it has transformed them before they even realized it was happening. If we could raise a new generation of truly conscious social media consumers, internet users, I think that might help a little bit.
My hope for Twitter and Elon Musk is that it's like the anacondas that eat the pigs and they both die. That'd be an ideal solution. Mike Milken in the front.
That was very idealistic.
I've got a vicious streak. That's why I'm so conservative.
I feel like I'm now in an episode of Mutual of Omaha's Wild Kingdom, you know?
Mike?
Most things in life, and you spoke about it on the last session, you know where they're going to lead. It just seems to me that most of the media or the people working in government aren't dealing with solutions to what the problem and where it's leading, so therefore we lead there. How do you see a change
That's a big question. If I understood your question correctly, you were saying that fewer and fewer people in government and politics are talking about or involved in solutions.
Well, decades ago, there was a report, A Nation at Risk. And it told us if someone had put this educational system in, a foreign power, we would have a revolution. Yet we know test scores adjusted for COVID are approaching all-time lows. So I don't see a large enough group in the media or politics trying to change the course of history. Most of this is now being pushed on to philanthropic efforts. How do we change that?
So, small question, how do we save America? 4 minutes.
We got 4 minutes.
4
so we're
minutes
good.
to
We're good,
answer
yeah.
it. Look, great solution. The solutions to very large problems tend to come in through the side door. We've had umpteen thousand commissions calling attention to the decline in public education. The crisis in higher education is well known, and you can look at other major American problems, similar stories where anything you try to do frontally isn't going to work because you're going to get so many different stakeholders with so many different opinions that it's going to become a giant traffic jam, policy traffic jam. But I think there are opportunities at the edges that could become the main thing. And I'll just give you one example, not from K through 12 education, but something I've been thinking about in terms of higher education. There are today a whole series of colleges and universities that are, let's say, not in the top 20, not even in the top 50, but you probably know their names and they're ranked somewhere between 50 and 150. All of these schools are facing an existential crisis because they don't have the kind of endowments that, say Harvard does, where they can just tell the world to kiss off and they're going to do whatever they're going to do. They have to be economically viable. The system they've had, a 4-year, mediocre, let's face it, liberal arts education is foundering. Parents are asking, why is this worth our money? Kids are asking, why is this worth our time? They have to reinvent themselves. You're seeing an effort, this University of Texas, University of Austin effort to start a new university. I think there's a huge opportunity for philanthropy to partner with those second-tier schools to help them reinvent themselves in ways that produce students who have a combination of skills they need to compete and are valuable in a workplace, and a worldview which allows them to be competent citizens. And I think that's low-hanging fruit waiting to happen. But it's going to happen through efforts that, again, sort of come in quietly, because if they're done in a big way, they're just going to be obstructed. I think in the challenge of K through 12 education, I keep hearing of philanthropic people who are saying, you know what, I don't like the private schools in my neighborhood, certainly not the public schools. I'm going to start my own school. And it's happening all over the country in ways that are quiet. In this room, I suspect there are people who have the capacity and the interest in doing things like that. But it's going to be, to borrow from George H.W. Bush's words, there's going to be 1,000 points of light, a much abused phrase, but actually Peggy Noonan's phrase, a very valuable one. And I think that's where we're going to find solutions. America, every 50 years, goes through not just a crisis of confidence, but genuine crisis of democracy. We were in a crisis of democracy in the early 1970s with Vietnam, Watergate. We were in a crisis in the 1930s, the 1890s, the 1850s. So 40 to 50 years, for whatever reasons, it happens on a cyclical basis. We've always managed to come out of it. And a country that is a free society will find resources in unexpected places from unexpected people thinking unexpected things and renewing what we're about. In part, I would add, by listening to people with whom we disagree.
Good
And-
wrap up.
And we're done.
We're done. Thank you all.
Thank you very much.